2 days. That's how long it took for an ordinary 4th of July trip to turn into one of the most talked about disappearances in the country. Nolan Wells went out to a barrier island off the Mississippi coast with dozens of friends, a trip his entire friend group made every single year. 2 days later, he was found in the water. Since then, investigators have been working with two very different kinds of evidence: what people remember and what can actually be proven. A recorded distress call, GPS coordinates accurate to the minute. And underneath all of it, a mother who says the story she's been told keeps shifting depending on who's telling it. This case is still active, and no official cause of death has been confirmed. Everything you're about to hear comes from public statements, official records, and interviews already on the record. Where the accounts line up with hard evidence, we'll tell you. Where they don't, we'll tell you that too. This is a true crime documentary built on what's actually been confirmed, not speculation. If you're new here, subscribe now, because this case is moving fast, and we'll be covering every confirmed update as it comes. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The interview came from a well-known true crime program, and it marked the first time anyone this close to Nolan had agreed to sit down on camera in this kind of detail. The young man at the center of it, identified as Warren, spent 2 days with producers before cameras ever rolled. Time enough, by all accounts, to actually get comfortable telling his story. What came out of it was the most detailed personal account yet of the hours leading up to Nolan's disappearance.
We had roughly 20 to 30 people coming on 3 separate boats with us. And so we were all following each other out there as one big group, 20 or 30 people spread out, where we all met at the dock before, and then we departed to go to Horn Island. It wasn't just, there were so many people, we had to split up between 3 boats, and we all left and all got there at the same time. I mean, Horn Island on the 4th of July is the most popular day to be on the water on, throughout the entire Gulf Coast. Roughly probably 2 to 3, maybe even 4,000 people out there. There were boats lined up off the island. I mean, there was one row of boats, and then there was another row of boats, and then there was a third row of boats. Yeah. I mean, there was people lined up all up and down the island. So we were parked on the north side, on the west tip. It wasn't just there, but just where we were, I mean, there was easily 1,000 people. It wasn't just us. Nolan was on Wyatt Pyron's 22 Triton on the way out.
Warren didn't hesitate when asked about his friendship with Nolan. He described a bond going back to elementary school, carried through middle school, high school, and into their first year of college. Constant contact, he said, and never once a real argument between them. He pushed back firmly on any suggestion that Nolan was difficult to be around, describing him instead as someone who never had an unkind word for anyone.
I had a couple conversations with Nolan that day, and I talked to him and a couple of my other buddies. In a group, I was not focused on anyone solely, looking and pointing anyone out. I mean, I was talking to my friends that I haven't seen in a while from high school. I was talking from people I knew from college. I was talking to, everybody my age and even people older. I mean, it was just a regular thing. We're all used to this. We've been out to the islands before. My buddies don't just go out to the island on 4th of July, but they go out, every weekend. I talked to Nolan, and, Nolan was drinking. Everybody was drinking, most of everybody. And I mean, Nolan seemed completely fine every time I talked to him. We had just regular conversations. Nolan was making me laugh. I had a couple conversations with Nolan and Javon, Nolan and my buddy James. I talked to Nolan a couple times, but it wasn't like I was strictly sitting there talking to Nolan the whole day. I mean, there was hundreds of people I knew out there, so.
That description matters because it doesn't stand alone. Nolan's own parents have described their son the same way, a young man with a big heart who made people feel noticed. His football coach used almost identical language, calling him humble and respected by everyone who knew him. 3 people, describing the same young man in nearly the same words, without ever comparing notes. Warren also addressed something that had drawn criticism online, the idea that Nolan's mother didn't really know her son's friend group. He explained the group usually gathered at his house or another friend's house, rather than at Nolan's, simply how their circle operated, not a sign of distance in the friendship itself. Then came July 4th, and Warren's account gave the clearest picture yet of just how big that day actually was. This wasn't a small private outing. The trip to Horn Island was something this entire friend group made every single year, a Gulf Coast tradition as routine as the holiday itself. On this trip, somewhere between 20 and 30 people made the crossing, spread across 3 separate boats, directly at odds with early online claims that it was only Nolan and a handful of others. By his account, they reached the island by mid-morning, to a shoreline packed for what looked like miles in every direction. Thousands of people, in places 3 rows deep along the sand. Think about what that means for an investigation like this one. Thousands of potential witnesses. Thousands of phones capable of capturing a photo or a video without anyone realizing it would matter later. And yet, weeks later, the clearest account of Nolan's final hours still comes down to a small handful of friends, each describing the same afternoon slightly differently. Somewhere in a crowd that size, somebody saw something. The challenge now isn't a shortage of witnesses. It's finding the right ones and getting them to come forward. Once ashore, Warren said the day played out the way it always does on that trip. Music, food, friends catching up with people they hadn't seen since high school. He said he crossed paths with Nolan more than once that afternoon, and every time, Nolan seemed relaxed, in good spirits, entirely himself. Hold on to that detail, because it's the last point in this story where every account agrees. Nolan was fine. Nolan was happy. Whatever happened to him did not happen because something was visibly wrong that day. It happened somewhere in the gap between an ordinary afternoon and a phone call 2 days later that changed everything for his family. At some point that afternoon, the boat Warren and much of the group had arrived on developed a mechanical problem, forcing an earlier departure than planned. Nolan chose to stay behind, intending to head back later with a different group of friends. This is where a friend's memory meets something far more concrete. Emergency audio obtained by a national news outlet appears to confirm part of this exact timeline. The recording captures a distress call from the boat's operator, reporting mechanical failure as the group tried to leave the island, placed at approximately 4 in the afternoon, roughly an hour after Nolan was last reportedly seen. Separately, GPS records pulled from state marine authorities show that same boat departing Horn Island at 4:31 that afternoon, a timestamp accurate almost to the minute. For the first time in this case, this isn't just memory, it's documentation, a recorded call, a tracked departure time. 2 independent pieces of hard evidence that, so far, line up with what's been said publicly about that boat and that hour. There's something almost like relief in a detail like that, and something like heartbreak too. Relief, because for once, part of this timeline can be verified independently of anyone's memory. Heartbreak, because even a timestamp this precise can only tell us when the boat left. It can't tell us what happened to the friend who didn't leave with it. Not every part of this story lines up as cleanly as that timestamp. Somewhere in his final confirmed hours, Nolan spoke with a young woman he'd met on the island that day. According to Nolan's mother, that young woman reached out to her directly, early on, to describe their conversation. A passing hello, she said, then goodbye. Nothing more. But that's not the only account Nolan's mother has heard. In her own words, what this young woman told her didn't fully match what she's heard from other people who were there that same afternoon. She's called it one more example of inconsistencies in this case that she still can't fully explain. Try to imagine sitting with that as a parent, handed one account of your son's final hours, only to have it quietly not line up with what everyone else remembers. Not enough to prove anything, not enough to disprove anything either. Just enough to leave a mother checking every new detail against everything she's already been told. The family's attorney, Ben Crump, has addressed this directly, telling reporters that the accounts given by the group who were on that island don't fully match one another, and that sorting out where those differences come from is part of what investigators still need to do. That's a significant thing for an attorney to say publicly on a family's behalf, and it reflects how much of this case remains unresolved, even with a timeline that, on paper, looks increasingly well documented. Nolan's parents, for their part, have publicly rejected the leading theory floated early in this case, that Nolan simply wandered off at some point and accidentally drowned. In their eyes, that explanation doesn't account for everything they've been told, or for how much of it has shifted the longer this investigation has gone on. They've said plainly they believe something more serious may have happened to their son. Law enforcement has continued to ask for patience, saying investigators need time to be thorough before reaching any conclusion, and that no clear signs of foul play have been found so far. For investigators, that's standard language, a way of not overstating what's confirmed. For a family hearing it week after week, it starts to feel like something else, like being told gently to keep waiting without ever being told for how long. Warren carries his own complicated place in all of this. He's the son of a local judge, a detail that became public early on, and added another layer of scrutiny to an already intense conversation. It was Warren who called Nolan's mother the night of the 4th, letting her know her son hadn't come home, the call that set the search in motion. His mother has said publicly that he's cooperated fully with investigators. She's also said her own family has received threats since this case went national, serious enough that she now fears for her children's safety. That's worth sitting with. Whatever ultimately happened to Nolan, threatening teenagers and their families over a case that's still under investigation helps no one, and it's added a second layer of fear running underneath this story. One family is afraid because their son is gone and they don't have an answer. Another is afraid because their son was there that day, and for some corners of the internet, that alone has been enough to treat him as guilty of something nobody has actually proven. Neither fear cancels out the other. Both are real. So where does this leave the actual facts, as they stand right now? Here's what can be said with confidence. Documented evidence, a recorded distress call, and GPS tracking data supports that the boat carrying Warren and much of the group left Horn Island at approximately 4:31 that afternoon, following a mechanical failure. Multiple friends agree that Nolan chose to stay behind rather than leave with that group. Beyond that point, the accounts start to diverge. One young woman's description of her time with Nolan, relayed through his mother, doesn't fully match what his mother has heard from others who were there. The family's attorney has said publicly that some accounts from that day don't align with each other, and that sorting out why is central to where this investigation goes next. Nolan's own parents have rejected the leading theory of an accidental drowning, saying they believe something more serious may have happened. No official cause of death has been released. Toxicology results remain unfinished. An independent autopsy the family's attorney has promised to make public may or may not have been announced by the time you're watching this. What's certain is this: a mother said goodbye to her son on July 3rd. 2 days later, he was found. And in the weeks since, this case hasn't narrowed toward an answer. It's widened, pulling in emergency audio, GPS records, accounts that don't fully line up, and a family publicly rejecting the explanation they've been offered so far. Somewhere in Mississippi tonight, a mother is still trying to reconcile two different versions of her son's last conversation with a stranger. A father is still asking why the explanation on the table doesn't match the son he raised. Siblings are living in a house that feels permanently unfinished, waiting for something that lets them actually begin to grieve, instead of having to keep fighting for basic answers while they do it. This isn't a case with an ending yet. It's a case where the documented timeline keeps getting sharper, even as the full truth behind it keeps slipping further out of reach. And somewhere in that gap between what's been proven and what still hasn't been explained, a family is left holding both their grief and their unanswered questions, with no way to set either one down until someone finally gives them the truth. If this update gave you information you hadn't heard before, that alone says something about how much of this story is still coming out in pieces, weeks after it began. Subscribe if you want to stay with this case as it develops, because based on everything laid out today, this is far from finished. And let us know in the comments which part of this update stood out to you most. We read every one, and we'll be back with the next confirmed update as soon as it comes.